Hey guys, so today I'm going to go over the notes for 4.3 evolution as a force for change with you. So we've got some definitions here. Selective pressures are environmental resistance factors that can affect which individuals survive and reproduce and which are eliminated. So remember, environmental resistance factors are anything that limits the population of a species, right? Things that work against it. So examples of selective pressures are predators, parasites, drought, climate, anything like that. So, what it means by selective pressures is whenever one of these factors comes along, there will be some individuals in a species that, for one reason or another, are better able to survive that environmental resistance factor. So, these environmental resistance factors sort of like select the ones that don't survive as well, and then those will uh, be eliminated usually, and then the ones that survive better uh, survive to reproduce and live. Okay, so natural selection, which you've heard of them before, I'm sure, the process by which environmental resistance factors or selective pressures tend to eliminate members of a population which are least well adapted to cope with their environment, and therefore allow those better adapted individuals to survive and reproduce. Okay, you've probably heard of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is the mechanism by which natural selection occurs. Okay. The word fitness. Fitness are traits of any organism that allow the organism better chances at survival and reproduction. And adaptations are any change in the structure or function of an organism that allows it to adjust better to its environment, thereby increasing its ability or chance to survive and or reproduce. Okay, so your book lists 5 categories for adaptations. Okay, now, one thing is important for you to understand about adaptations. An individual organism cannot just create an adaptation to itself because it wants to or needs to. So, like um, I don't know, a lizard can't grow a coat of fur because the climate's getting colder. It just can't decide to do that. Um, Adaptations are changes in structure or function that occur through mutation and that are either beneficial or not beneficial. If they're beneficial, it helps the organism survive better, then that one will survive and reproduce, and those genes will get spread throughout the gene pool. If the mutation or adaptation is not beneficial, that organism will die off and it will not reproduce and it will not spread those genes through the gene pool. Okay. All right. So the first category is coping with climatic and other abiotic factors. So this is a species, something about an organism or a species that makes it better able to do that. So examples for animals, something like a polar bear having heavy fur would help it survive colder climates. Okay. Some like geese flying or birds flying south. Uh, Bears hibernating. So it's either a trait or a function of like how they do something. Okay. For plants, uh, trees dropping their leaves in the winter, deciduous trees. Okay. Um, some plants, like tulips and other stuff, have they're what are called bulb plants, which means the part above the ground dies off, but the root part, the bulb, is what kind of like stays alive and then regrows the next year. It helps it survive colder climates and stuff like that. Okay. All right. Second category, obtaining food and water for animals or obtaining nutrients, energy, and water for plants. So these are adaptations that make them better at doing that. So examples for animals would be like giraffes having like a long neck. So we're talking about the actual characteristic of the animal. You don't just say like, oh, giraffes. Like that's not an example of the adaptation. The adaptation is the long neck. Okay. Anteaters have these long, thin noses, like snouts, which helps them get into anthills and to eat. Let's see what else. Frogs have quick, sticky tongues. Oops, sorry. Zoom out a little there. Okay. Examples for plants. So, I'm trying to think. Plants having larger leaves to collect more sunlight. Extensive, so like large root systems and root hairs that helps a plant get more water and nutrients from the soil. Trees growing taller to get more sunlight. So those are examples of adaptations for plants that help them obtain nutrients, energy, and water. All right, let's go to the third category. Escaping from or protecting against predation and for resistance to disease-causing or parasitic organisms. So the animals, we've already talked a lot about this. This would be our defense, like some examples would be some of the things for our defense mechanisms. Okay, so like a porcupine quills, skunk spray, the lizard shooting blood out of its eye. Okay, those would all be examples. Examples for plants. Some plants have thorns. Thorns help protect the plants from grazing animals. Okay. There's something called a rosette form Okay, it's in your book. And let me actually see if I can find the page here real quick. Uh, so a rosette form is where the plant, like dandelion, they're showing dandelions there. They kind of, where the leaves, instead of growing up towards like kind of like up towards the sky, the leaves will grow almost horizontal, like out and flat along the ground. And what that does is it helps keep the leaves out of the reach of grazing animals. They can't get down that close to the ground to actually eat, so it protects the plant that way. Okay. Um, let's see what else. Cactus needles. Some plants have poisonous chemicals in them to keep bugs and other stuff from eating them. Okay. All right. Fourth category: finding or attracting mates for animals, or pollinating and setting seed for plants. Okay, so examples for animals would be like a peacock tail feathers, the colorful feathers for a peacock. Um, let's see, dolphins. Dolphins actually have like mating calls. A lot of animals have mating calls, but birds do stuff like that too. Dolphin mating calls. Um, the okay, let me see. I'm gonna see if I can pull this up. There's something called a okay. So this um, the male Tungara frog. See if I can click on one of these. So it like it like puffs up. It expands its throat out like really wide. Um, so that's a an example. So Tungara, or I'm just gonna say frog. Frog expands throat. Okay. All right. Examples for plants. So this would be like setting seed, or getting it pollinated. So bright colors for flowers that attracts pollinators, right? Um, there's something called there's like a rotting meat plant. Has this chemical smell that uh, yeah, okay, so it's this thing, and it has they're huge, and it smells like rotten meat, and what it does is that attracts like um, it attracts like flies and other things like that, which actually then it uses to pollinate it. So it attracts the pollinators through this nasty rotten meat smell. Um, so that's somewhat interesting. Okay. All right. Our last category: adaptations for migrating animals or dispersing seeds for plant. So when we're talking about migrating, we're not talking about just like flying south for the summer. We're talking about like literally animals migrating or going from one area to a new area to live. So the only real example they give for animals is just migration. Migration of for animals. Um, like from area to area. Okay. Dispersing seeds for plants. Um, Clinging burrs. Okay, if you've ever had a dog that runs into the woods, or maybe if you've ever gone into the woods, um, might come back with all these like uh, or clinging, yeah, clinging. Okay, there we go. These things on right, and they stick and they're super hard to get off. That's actually the plant's way of spreading its seed out and uh, making it go further away from the plant to disperse it. Okay. Um, what else? Like the parachute or helicopter seeds. So like if you think like a dandelion seed that when the wind takes it, it blows farther away, so it has the ability to spread out or disperse. The goal of the plant with those is to get the seeds far away, so they're not all competing for the same resources. So the further they can disperse and spread out, the better of a chance they have of as a species of increasing their population. Okay. All right. So that is the 5 categories for adaptation and some examples for each. All right. Now, onto the back. Alternatives for species faced with new powerful selective pressure. So, what this means is if something new comes in that is threatening a species and threatening its survival, there are essentially 3 responses or 3 results that can occur. 1, the species can adapt. A population of survivors adapt to the new condition through natural selection and become better as a whole species, become better able to withstand that selective pressure. 2, migration. The surviving population may migrate to an area where conditions are more suitable to them. 3, if the species cannot do either of the first 2, it will then become extinct. So, what are some keys to a species' survival? What are things that can make it more or less likely to survive or not? Well, geographical distribution, how spread out the species population is. The more spread out it is, the more likely it is to survive. The more condensed or the less spread out it is, the more likely it is to go extinct. Okay, because if something happens in just that area, and that's the only area where they live, then that can wipe out the whole species. Where if they're far spread apart, then the chance of a selective pressure being in all those areas at once is much less. Second thing, specialization to a given habitat or food supply. And I think I mentioned this in class, I think at one point. Koala and eucalyptus trees. That's all the koalas eat. So if something happens to the eucalyptus tree, the koalas can be screwed. Like they have a very, very high chance of going extinct because that's all they eat. So something that, that eats a lot of different things, if one of their food sources goes extinct, they've got a much better chance of survival. So if something is specialized to a certain habitat or food supply, that actually makes them more vulnerable to extinction. The genetic variation within the gene pool of the species, the amount of different genes within the species. We talked about this with the Tay-Sachs disease stuff. So the more different genes that are in a gene pool, the more likely you are to have some members of that population able to withstand the whatever the pressure is that's attacking the species. You guys have all heard about the Irish potato famine, right? That wiped out like the entire crops, and hundreds of thousands of people, I think, starved, or tens of thousands of people starved in Ireland. The reason that occurred was because the potatoes that they planted, there was only like a few varieties, so there wasn't a lot of genetic diversity, and there was this potato blight that attacked the potatoes and was killing them off, and it wiped out nearly all of their potato supply. Whereas if they had had a lot of genetic diversity, then it would have been a much higher chance that some of those varieties of potatoes would have had something that would have allowed them to resist the disease, and therefore it would not have wiped them all out. Okay, that's how this works. So the more genetic variation within the gene pool, the better it is for a species in terms of survival. Okay, and the last one, reproductive rate relative to the rate of environmental change. In other words, how fast a species can reproduce, the number of offspring, and how long it takes to give birth. As you might expect, the more offspring you have and the faster you can give birth, the more likely you are to survive because you're just pumping out more and more offspring. Okay, if it takes you a long time to reproduce and you only have a few, then that makes you much more vulnerable to extinction because you can't reproduce and basically restock the population as quickly. Okay, so 4 things that are keys to survival. All right, vulnerability to environmental change. This is how vulnerable are species to changes in the environment. Okay. So these are properties of, so vulnerable species, these are properties of vulnerable species. These are properties of highly adapted or less vulnerable species. And as you can see, they're essentially the opposite of each other. Narrow distribution means not as far spread out, wider spread out. Small population, more vulnerable. Large population, less vulnerable. Genetic, so all of these things, you can see all of them. How does this look in terms of environmental change? Okay, well, if you get rapid environmental change, vulnerable species have a high chance of going extinct. Whereas highly adaptive species will go through a process of survival, adaptation, and speciation, possibly. Speciation is where a species essentially evolves into 2 different species or a new species. What if you have slow environmental change? Well, then vulnerable species usually go through survival, adaptation, and speciation, as do highly adaptive species. They both do, more likely to survive. So in your book, this is on page 98, they've got kind of a little diagram here with that stuff kind of together. So you have some kind of a changing abiotic factor, like climate change or a flooding of an area or something like that. If it happens rapidly, that's the blue here, the vulnerable species most likely will go extinct. If it happens rapidly, the blue down here, highly adaptive species will survive, adapt, and speciate. The only thing, not the only, but basically vulnerable species only survive, adapt, and speciate if the change to the environment occurs slowly over time. Then they have enough time. Essentially, what that means is they have enough time to reproduce and get more generations that are better at surviving that environment. So they have a longer period of time for the beneficial genes to work their way through the gene pool to have future generations. But if the change happens too quickly, they're likely to go extinct. Okay, that is it. If you guys have questions, as usual, let me know.